act as sort of frames on the wall, and that's what I'm doing now, is placing some of those decorative interior elements. Diner. Great piece. That piece is so good at capturing that neon light. Well, we're setting about placing our drawing on the page. In the same manner that we did our drill, we're placing the large shape first, which is this rectangle, slightly oblique rectangle of the window, the main window towards the cafe, through which we see our characters. We see the entrance to the cafe, the light is streaming out of the window. But we're not putting it right in the center. We're putting it slightly left, slightly high, so that we can make a little bit of the reflections. And we're giving it an ample size so that we can display the figures with a little larger style, perhaps put some details in the figures. And I'll spend a little time to get the basic position right. There's not a lot of perspective involved with this particular drawing. In fact, I've flattened it out a little bit just to make it somewhat more readable. But I'll draw the main window, the adjacent window. I'll allude to some of the building that's behind the entrance to the cafe, a little bit of the reflection, and that's, other than the figures, that's about it. We're going to place some of the elements in the drawing, but not, a lot of it is going to be left to the paint, and so we don't have to draw every little detail. It's not really a bad exercise, it's just I don't want to clutter the drawing to the point where I feel I have to stop and start a lot with my brushwork. So I make the figures very simply so that I can be cued to kind of use my brush to describe the figures. I'll make some things rather clear, like the shapes of the overhead lamps, the bulbs that hang down from the ceiling. The window panes itself, yes, I'll create those, but in essence, not too much. I just want to get the basic lines in. And it's coming out very quickly because we've already gone through it a couple of times. And so these lines are already very familiar to me. I'm just trying to see them on this larger format and place the center of interest slightly off center, slightly high, slightly to the left. And I'm trying to envision how much of the periphery I want to show and how much is necessary to show. For example, we could make this smaller and paint more dark around it, give it a more imposing feeling, but in this particular painting, I want it to be almost, close to us so that we can feel the warmth coming out and we're sort of feeling drawn to the flame as a moth would be drawn to the flame. We're kind of drawn to this light coming out of the cafeteria. Not the cafeteria, the cafe. So I continue to build the figures and start to anticipate the next steps, which are what color is going to follow, where I'm going to place the colors initially, and then how I'm going to build out the painting from that. And I do want to give the figures a little more presence in this painting. In the studies, they were simply silhouettes. In this painting, I want them to have a little more character, a little more draw, So first of all, they're going to be a little bit of a larger size. Second, they're going to have a little more detail. And the rest of the painting is pretty much going to follow the same line as the studies that we just finished. In other words, it's largely going to be this light area in a dark surrounding. Within that dark surrounding, there'll be little bits of light and reflections and so on. But overall, it's going to be pretty light. I'm sorry, pretty dark around. All right, this is our drawing. And you can see hardly any drawing around the periphery or the lower section above the window, not much at all. This is to keep it so that I can do more with the brushwork and let the watercolor influence the painting a little bit. When I have a lot of lines, a lot of drawing, that tends to slow me down and forces me to concentrate on the shapes, which is sometimes a good thing, sometimes not a good thing. So this is the reason that I leave a little more drawing in my center of interest, where I want a little more detail, a little more nuance, especially on some difficult shapes. The figures can be difficult, so putting those in with pencil gives you a little more confidence. But definitely in the periphery is going to be quiet to begin with. Quiet, dark, and some shifting colors. This is all to kind of support the main idea, which is this glowing cafe at night. The light coming out and hitting the wet pavement, and there's some a shiny aspect to the pavement. There's still some drifting moisture too, as you will see as I address the upper part of the painting. And I want that to be conveyed, and we really can't do it with line. It has to be done with brush and paint. So that's the reason behind the drawing in the state that it is. And I'm starting directly with that focal area, building up some of the color that is going to be the attractive part of the painting, this quinacridone gold, which has a strong yellow hue, also has a bit of a oranginess to it, and is very transparent, so the white of the paper can really come through. And we're creating just a wash, a very pale wash, and into that wash we'll be adding some color up on top. But this helps me to isolate the whites of the globes, of the lights that are on the interior. Any sort of whites that I want on the tabletop, whether they be cups and saucers, glasses, just broken lights. Some of the moldings as well, they catch a bit of light, and so I'm leaving a white there. This is an important stage because it makes those obvious to me, and it makes it easier when I start to come into it with the really dark color to control that area and create those sorts of edges. Now you can see the paint is wet, so we're working basically wet into wet, adding more of that quinacridone gold, maybe a little bit of yellow ochre, and letting it drift down, letting it surround the light. The lights, the globes, we want them to really resonate from a distance. This is one way to do it, is to bring a high amount of contrast to a hard edge, use the white of the paper to give us the illumination that we want. Another way would be to use dry brush to the same effect and create sort of a sparkly, glittery edge, which also communicates a kind of glare or harsh light coming out, strong light coming out from a certain type of atmosphere. So there's always more than one way to do these things. I'm showing you whatever's kind of current with me, whatever's in the front of my mind is what I want to paint. But as those studies revealed, there are certainly more ways to do this, and each one is valid. Each way of working with the media is valid. Just depends on the sort of atmosphere that we want to create, whatever type of mood we're in, what's in the front of our mind, what has been itching to get out. That's kind of what drives the decision to choose any one technique. And, well, that's what's happening here, creating that luminous atmosphere above, isolating some whites, creating a warm light. That's what we're doing with a small brush into this area of the interior. And we're starting on rather a calm note. Typically, we've been starting our paintings with some big, broad washes and covering a lot of area, creating some graded qualities and establishing a tone to the paper right away. Here we're kind of addressing a smaller part of the painting, some details. All this is done with pretty small brushes, and creating this element, our center of interest, first. Perhaps this is a more direct way to do it. I'm thinking about, what if we did that in reverse, paint the exterior first, the atmosphere first, and then came to the interior. And it could work that way. This way we can measure a little better against our center of interest. If we can see it in front of us, we can measure the darks, the edges. We can measure those a little bit to the image that's already there. When we don't see anything, we're kind of guessing, and we have to fit the center of interest to the atmosphere we create. So it's a little bit of a reverse process. It can still work. It can still create a beautiful painting. This way seems simpler and more direct to me, so that's why I'm following this particular sequence. Now you see me carrying that same quinacre gold, definitely the mother color in this painting, because it's going to come out from behind the black that we paint later. It's going to resonate from the interior, fall into almost everything. Quinacridone gold. Interesting, when you mix it with black, it doesn't turn green as many yellows do. This simply gives it more of a warmth, gives the black a certain warmth. And so it's a bit of a new color for me. I haven't used it a lot, but I was attracted to it because of its sort of amber-like quality. And it's very close to the ochre in a certain way. It also has some sense of cadmium in that it's kind of a glowing hue, a bit of red in it. So there's a lot of interest in this color, and it may become a regular color for me. It may disappear. I don't know. In any case, I've got that upper section stated, and I want to work on the upper section first so that I can address the wet on wet foreground in the next stage. That's why you see me really working hard to mix up a strong, dark, neutral tint, and some alizarin crimson, some burnt sienna, quite thick, and going right into that top part of the painting, trying to get a good line, leave some of that brightness there before I come down. And already it's kind of setting off that bright yellow. Once I get this area wet and get the edges that I want along the architecture, once I get those, then I'll start to manipulate the black a little more. But at this stage, I'm simply trying to get it covered. I do want to leave some lighter, brighter areas, so we'll leave those now. And then try to tighten up some of those edges before we move on to the foreground. The interesting thing about nocturnes is we really reside in the dark side of the palette quite a bit. And in watercolor, that's actually pretty unusual. There's a few painters that paint nocturnes regularly. Winslow Homer did quite a few, and especially in his later years, he was working up in Cape Ann, and some of the watercolors that he produced in his final years up there were quite dark. Some nocturnes, some done during the twilight hour. They were celebrating, I believe it was a 100-year anniversary, and up at the Cape Ann Museum this past year. And so they had a large collection of Winslow Homer's work from his early years as an illustrator to years working in the war, and to years working purely as a fine artist up in the Cape Ann area. And some of the watercolors that I saw were brand new to me and very fresh, very lively, sort of a departure, I felt, from his more recognizable work, and really quite painterly, and using bright colors, also very rich dark colors to create some of the images. So he's done quite a few nocturnes. Of course, I think of Whistler a lot when I think of Nocturne, and some of the subtle, beautiful paintings that he achieved. Turner, another one. In fact, one of his most resonant images, The Burning of Parliament, was a nocturne done. He actually witnessed the burning of Parliament from across the Thames and was so attracted to this scene that he hired a boat to take him out and brought his watercolor sketchbook and paints and sat in the boat for a few hours as Parliament was on fire and the flames grew. He continued to paint. He got so close, in fact, that some of the pages in his sketchbook have little marks where embers were falling and burning the pages. And for Turner, this was a significant artistic event. And it's a tragic event, of course. And sometimes the artist doesn't see it that way. For him, he was enamored with the smoke and the light and the reflection on the Thames River. And he continued to paint, and I think he must have produced close to 80, 90 works, all based on this one experience. Many of them sketches, later to become oil paintings or larger watercolors. In any case, these sorts of kind of monumental moments come about, usually as a surprise, and he was completely ready to embrace it. As soon as he saw it, he knew he had to get into the Thames and go to try and capture this moment. Well, you see, I'm starting to develop that dark, and not just a simple flat black, but here and there I'm spraying it with the bottle or adding a little water, or in places I'm taking really thick dark paint into the wet area and making it darker. This will probably pose it's a little difficult to see in the video because it's very shiny, for one thing. It's highly saturated so that the paper's reflecting the light, and it makes it hard for us to see the color that's happening there. The color itself is quite dark, so it's hard to see the transitions. And even for me, as I'm standing in front of it, a lot of this is kind of based on approximation. I'm guessing that this is going to dry darker, this is going to dry lighter, this is going to give me a faint transition, this is going to give me a really strong accent. I place the marks, and sometimes I'm placing them and they don't really even register, and after it dries, suddenly it's there, bang. So painting in this dark side, the darker side of the palette, is challenging for that reason. Maybe it's a good idea too, because it does require us to think more about the consistency of the paint. That becomes a bigger issue as we work with darker colors, is really thinking more about consistency. And I'm starting to paint the wet on wet foreground. I'm wetting the page with another wash of the quinacre gold. Everything seems to be starting from that color, and hesitating to join them right away. I create a little bit of an edge, and then I'll develop the periphery, and then finally I'll develop the cast reflections from the interior coming out onto the pavement. So I keep building this dark, and though it's hard to see, I'm using a very strong neutral tint, and then I reach for a little bit of alizarin crimson, looking for the consistency. Well, it varies, but since I'm working into a wet area, I would like to use a very strong dark, almost a pure black, and sort of emulate the intensity. We need some of those intense tones here and there. In general, this background, this surrounding dark is going to look very similar. But as we stand in front of it and watch the painting unfold, it's going to lighten in some areas, darken in others, and give us that sort of movement, the movement that we might feel if it's raining and a bit of mist is coming down. And this is the opportune time to do it because the paper's drying rather quickly. I want to create soft transitions, soft edges, even though I'm creating the reflection of a very strong interior. I want to keep the edges soft. So I have to do this rather quickly. More quickly than we're comfortable with, than I'm comfortable with. That's one of the main things that makes this technique a little difficult, is we have to work faster than we'd like. And yes, it's a reflection of that shape, but I want there to be a little variance, a little change, and there is change because of the edges, but I'm going to pull in this right side a little bit and a little bit on the left side as well to give it a slight variation. More thick paint, working from the bottom up, trying to get a bit of a graded wash that should help the foreground to come forward. Some real strong color under this ledge. This is an important edge here. That's why you see me really pushing the heel of the brush in and trying to get a nice straight line. Some broken edges are good, but the overall angle and the overall edge should be rather straight. Now my paper is buckling, so it looks a bit distorted from this angle. This almost always happens when we work wet into wet. We get some buckling just because the paper itself becomes saturated. There's really no way around that when we have such a wet area. 300-pound paper, maybe. Stretched paper, I've had mixed results. I know some people claim that they can keep it completely flat all the way through this sort of saturated wash. Possibly. I haven't figured out the way yet. But another interesting technique, which I haven't shown you yet, and that was popular with Edgar Whitney and his students, was to completely saturate the paper, front and back. Tony Couch does this. What he does is he'll do the drawing on dry paper. Then he'll, before he fixes the paper to a board, he takes a sponge and he wets the back of the paper, and he turns it over and he wets the front of the paper. So it is just like a wet noodle, and he puts it onto a flat surface, and it's perfectly flat. And then he'll squeegee out some of the moisture on the top surface, and he's ready to go. And that painting stays flat, perfectly flat through the whole course of his painting. This is another way to do it. And he uses flat brushes, so this makes it work a little better. When you're carrying a lot of liquid to the page with these mop brushes, I think it wouldn't work as well. But a flat brush carries very little liquid to the paper, and so this sort of technique of stretching the paper or wetting the paper completely before starting your painting is another possibility. So many things to discover in the world of watercolor. We're just scratching the surface. These are the reflections of the figures yet to come. I had to do them at this stage. I didn't have to, but I chose to do them at this stage because the surface of the paper was still wet. And you can see now the colors starting to shift a little bit. You're getting the alizarin crimson separating from the neutral tint, and you're getting a nice kind of feathering quality to all of this. Just adding a bit of texture with saliva. And even though I'm at a very steep angle, you see that those marks are staying put. The reason they are is, in spite of the fact I'm working in a wet area, I use a small brush and I take out some of the paint before I put it into that wet area, so that the brush is delivering paint at the same time it's acting a bit like a sponge to take out some of the moisture. So you can control the mark much better doing it that way. At this stage, I want to return to the upper part, the area where we've got where we're going to place our figures and some of the tables, some of the moldings, some of the details in this upper section. Now you can see as it's drying, some of the lighter areas are looking good. What I'm doing here is just manipulating the board so that I can make some of these longer horizontals a little more effectively. This is basically comes down to ergonomics. I can kind of rest my palm a little bit and get a nice sharp line in a natural way. A little bit easier to do it this way. And if you notice when I'm making this line, it's not fully formed. It's definitely kind of strong where it intersects with another part of the architecture, either the side of the window or the piece that's running up the center, or the change in angle there. But in the middle, it kind of tapers or even disappears. And this sort of mark, I feel, is so much more lively than a mark that's the same width, the same strength. In other words, a perfect straight line. I feel that this sort of mark is much better. And so that's why I'm making an effort to make it a sort of calligraphic mark. Well, we've practiced our figures a little bit so that we're actually, I feel a little comfortable now in painting those figures. Painted them a couple times already, so I know the shapes that I'm after and I know the sequence. Generally, I like to paint them from the torso, just to block in the torso, and then later on put the head. And we can do a lot by where we put the head. We can completely redirect the body. If we put it on one side of the shoulder or the other side of the shoulder, we make it look completely different. So generally, I'll start with the main posture of the figure. That means the torso, and if we see the legs, those follow. But here we're kind of fortunate because we only have to worry about the torso. Everything that's below the table, we can kind of fudge that. We don't have to be too perfect in that. But with the upper part, the torso, the head, anything else, we need some certainty and we need to be accurate. So there we have to work a little harder. In any case, I like to start with that shape of the torso because it really sets the tone of the posture. It can be leaning, it can be straight up, it can be bent over. Once we get that placed, we sort of have the gesture in place. The head should naturally follow that, but I save that till I place the torso so that I can maybe add one more, feeling of movement to the figure. And when you're putting figures into any sort of scene, of course you'll have reference photos and it'll probably be obvious, but there's always, each scene has certain poses. For example, a classic pose is to see someone hunched over their computer these days in the cafe, researching a paper or working on social media or whatever they're doing. That's so typical. Another typical scene is to see people kind of leaning towards each other and with their coffee in the hand and having a conversation. Or you can see a waiter delivering something, or there's certain poses that tend to happen in certain situations or certain locations. And that's what I'm thinking about, if I want to improvise with the pose. In this case, I'm following the photograph pretty much. I'm not deviating that much. I am trying to be painterly about it, but I'm using basically the same poses. But if I'm improvising and adding figures or creating them based on what I want to see, then I do think about what's typical in this sort of context. Well, this is the lower part beneath the table. So I'm dividing that with just a little bit of a white line. You can see that the figure continues below. Sometimes it's the legs coming off the chair. Sometimes it's just the body. But in front of them is a table, and it's all kind of one table, sort of like a countertop, and they're sitting at this. So that's why I'm leaving that small white mark there. And I'll do a few things to kind of touch up the figures, add a little bit of color, or add the back of a chair, or the computer screen, or a cup, or a handbag, something simple, just to make it a little more interesting. After this part dries, then I'll add more descriptive marks for the hair, for the features, for the clothing. Well, we return to our painting, and we're looking to approach the interior again. The color is dried, to my taste, just a little bright. And so I want to tone it down and use the opportunity to reshape the orbs or the hanging lights that we see from the street, give those a little more of a positive feeling. And so I'm just taking a little bit of water to wet the area first, and then I'm going to drop in some quinacre gold as well as a little bit of red and create a graded wash from the ceiling down. That's how I'm starting this second go into the painting. You can tell it's a little grayer wash, but the goal here is to make the lights stand out a little more, create some a kind of smoother edge where the top of the window meets the darkness of the outside frame. I feel that's a little too strong right now, and I want to make the transition a little smoother. Also, when I'm doing this, I'm going to start to work in the figures below and bring them to life a little bit. So that's how I'm starting this second go into the painting, is just by revisiting the center of interest and painting that to some conclusion before I address the details in the foreground, in the signage, in some of the other small areas. And I'm very conscious of the edges above. That bright edge is important to me to keep a little bit of thickness to the wall, a little bit of definition, a little bit of interest, visual interest. And then starting with a little darker application, I'll let it drift down and surround those hanging light fixtures. I've enjoyed painting nocturnes. I think they represent an opportunity to see the nature in a unique condition. We've even done some on location, which is a real challenge because you have to find a way to light your surface as you're working. And they do make some portable lights, but generally what I do is I try to stand in an area that's lit. In an urban environment like Boston, it's not a problem. You have light coming from storefronts and overhead, so you can usually find a place to stand. But sometimes in smaller villages or things like that, it's a little more difficult. And one strategy is to start before the light really disappears. Start your drawing, get everything placed, get your palette ready to go, and then and kind of form a plan like we did in the beginning to create the luminous area first and then really surround it with the darks. In any case, it's kind of an unusual experience because you don't see everything that you're doing. You're kind of painting with a little bit of guesswork. And for that reason, it's exciting, and you're always a little surprised when you get back home. But the memory that you take away and the experience of just standing in front of your subject, observing it in its natural condition, is very important. I continue to talk about that and practice that myself, going outside whenever I can to paint in the open air, because I think it brings a certain authenticity to your work. When I'm looking at shows, group shows, regional shows, I can usually find the pieces that were painted outside. There's just a different character to them. The light is more believable. The the feeling of being there is certainly present. All right. Well, our figures have dried. We've achieved the darkness that we want in the background. Now we want to bring these figures to life a little bit, give them more of a character. we do this we can do this even though the figures are quite small. So um, the some of them are most of them are wearing a heavy jacket or clothing of some sort. This is helpful because then we don't have to do too many additions. We can simply paint the jacket, the head, the face, and anything that's nearby. You see already some of the backs of the chairs are sticking up, or one fellow's working on a laptop. 3 are having a conversation, so we can do little things that actually make quite a difference. One of them is adding a little bit of color, a little distinguishing color. Another is placing some small touches in the head and face to make it look more, give the figure more of a directed glance. We can add some highlights later on to give the figure a little more form, three-dimensional quality. In any case, this is sort of like seasoning the soup. We add enough flavor to make it, give it character and to give it believability, but we don't want to add too much. We don't want to go crazy here. So I'm working with the small brush, taking my time, trying to envision the sort of things that I think will stand out. For example, you see this jacket I just placed on the fellow sitting down. I left a gap there which we'll read as showing us the front of an open jacket. And that little addition, it's not in the photograph, but I've used it consistently in my work, and it just makes that area so much more interesting, that one little gap in the jacket. The fellow that we're painting now, or the person we're painting now, not sure if it's another male or female. Any case, they're facing the person who's talking. So I'm leaving that little highlight on the shoulder. And that highlight shows us that the head is, we're seeing the back of the figure. We could easily make it the other way, but this sort of variety in your figures gives it a little more authenticity as well. In other words, the variety, by variety, I mean not just changing the color, but the position, the height, the tilt of the head. I try to always keep that in mind when I'm working with figures. Sometimes I get a little regimented. In other words, everybody looks like they're in the same uniform, but this time I have a little better idea what to do. Just add a little color, change the hair color, the position of the figure. These things will give me the variety that I want. This female is wearing a red jacket and looking towards, so this is a group, right? We're having a group that probably have visited the show and are having a little coffee before they head home, talking about, what they thought of the theater and the play. This is what enters my mind as I'm painting them, is the sort of interaction that they're having. This area below can be a nuisance because we tend to want to paint individual things, an individual chair, an individual leg, an individual umbrella, or whatever we may see below the table. But I try to group the things in this sort of scenario, and showing a few bits of light coming through, but otherwise a very generic kind of flat gathering of shapes that really by themselves have no meaning, but when they're attached to the table and the figure above, it all makes sense. Well, we're going to try something here a little unusual. We're going to put the lettering of the cafe, and I'm giving myself a little help by trying to see if I can draw a couple of the letters on. It's a simple name, Tate. That name means father in Yiddish, and it's a very popular brand in Boston. And also the way it's stylized is attractive. This particular signage floats on the glass and pushes back against our subject. If we can place it in a convincing fashion, then it's going to serve its purpose, which is to give us a better read of the glass, the pane of glass, and a little bit of local reference. Certainly people who live in Boston are going to recognize this instantly. And that sort of detail is enjoyable, gives it I guess, a little more authenticity. But putting it on is tricky. If you're not a sign painter, sign painters can do this with their eyes closed, but I want to do it. I'm not a sign painter, and I'm painting it more as a shape rather than a letter. And I'm trying to also think like a painter and do it somewhat in a calligraphic manner. And this is the tricky part, is getting the placement, the alignment, the spacing, and still have it be somewhat imperfect. Actually, I don't have to worry too much about imperfection. The brush I'm using is not ideal for this. In addition, there's some the interior of this chain is rather unique. They use a lot of white tile in their locations, and with borders of sort of a mocha brown or linear decorative tiles that act as sort of frames on the wall. And that's what I'm doing now, is placing some of those decorative interior elements. And again, it's something, we have a photograph, so we're seeing everything, but we don't have to put everything. We can be selective and put enough so that it creates some depth in the background. I guess that's the primary function of putting these sorts of things, is you want to create a little depth in the background. So we could put more figures back there. We can put some paintings on the walls, or we can put ceiling fans. There's a few things that we could add. And I'm choosing to add those tiled borders towards the back. Well, moving right along, this foreground is interesting. We've achieved those soft edges that I was after. You can see the color feels, or the painting at this stage has dried, but it still feels like a wet surface. All those soft edges, the vertical sensation, like the color is streaking down, reflecting downward, to make this feel more like the surface that we're walking on, a plane that we're walking on. These pavers become important. And placing them can be a little tricky. We want to keep the line as accurate, in the proper perspective as we can. And yet we still want to have it feel like a painting, like it's not mechanical, or it's not static. In other words, our line still needs to be somewhat lively. So I'm starting with the horizontals, and as they come forward, there's more space between them. They open up a little bit. And especially where I'm cutting through the bright area, I'm trying to use a very nice some crisp line here, dry line here, a broken line occasionally. And this will dry to give us the effect that we're seeing the reflections on top of the pavement, and give us a feeling of the surface. I put the opposing lines in somewhat of a broken fashion. I'm not drawing the line straight across, but I'm starting from the intersection and working back. This gives a touch of depth to the pavement. In other words, we see the joint more clearly, where the four corners of each paving stone. And this is also happens to be a little easier way to do it, at least for me. So I would not use a ruler in this scenario. My lines are certainly imperfect, but that is something that I want. That is something that I'm hopeful in achieving, is getting a believable line, but with a painterly quality. And every once in a while you're going to do this and it's just going to look wrong. So I guess the trick is, which comes with experience, is to be able to kind of see it before you paint it. And we do have the photographic reference, but I've really changed it quite a bit because there's literally, it's bricks pretty much where we are. I'm making these bigger pavers to keep simplicity and not make it too crowded down there. And so I can get an idea of the angles of the lines, but we still have to do it. Okay. Well, we've done about as much as we can in the lower foreground area to give us that feeling of a wet surface. We've done about as much as we can inside the cafe Tate. And what's left? We have a little work to do in the sign up above. I want to tackle that in a similar manner. I want to see it in front of me before I start so I get an idea of the proportion. I'm going to use opaque color for this. This is, on my brush I have a pigment called Jaune Brilliant, which is by Holbein, made by Holbein. It's a yellowish white. And the yellowish white is good in this instance because all the hues we're working with are warm, including the paper. Even the paper has a bit of warmth to it. So if I used the titanium white, this would feel very cold and out of place. So I'm using the Jaune Brilliant, painting the letters directly with the brush, trying to think also about the calligraphic aspect and making it readable, making it legible. I don't want it to be too powerful right now in this the state that you see. It's too bright. It's too bright. It is going to dry a little lighter because I've mixed in some water with the pigment. I'm not using it straight out of the tube as I usually do. I've mixed in a bit of water, and my experimental nature is prodding me here to spray it. And I have my fingers crossed. What I'm hoping to achieve by that is the color is going to soften and give us more of a glowing quality to the sign. And it's also going to recede and not be as attention-getting as it is right now. This is almost an advertisement because it's so bright, and in one way it takes over the picture. So you see me approaching it with that spray bottle, and I'm watching it carefully to make sure that that color is soft and moving out a little bit. And I'll add a spritz here and there and watch it some more. And when I reach a point where I feel it's enough, then I'll just cross my fingers and hope that it dries properly. Another thing, one more adjustment. You see those two spots of light over to the right-hand side. They break up that dark area nicely, but they also are a little too potent right now. So I want to add a little bit of color, and I'm just going to add a little bit of, I think, a little bit of yellow back there. You can tell I'm watching it and apprehensive about spraying it again, but yeah. So we want to address these two lights back there, which pull us in back. They pull us back. There's a nice reflection underneath them. There's some nice softness above them. So there's a nice atmosphere. However, they're a little too bright, and I want to tone them down. So it's dried in this corner. I take just a little bit of the cadmium yellow and brush it over the top with this flat brush. It's going to mute the light. At the same time, it's going to give a little bit more glow back there so that we feel the atmosphere a little more. This is a quality of watercolor that I like, which is you can tint an area or you can adjust an area after it's dried just by adding a little color. And the color actually is floating now, but once it dries, it's going to lighten and affect the area much more subtly.